Close your eyes for a second. I want you to imagine a world with no fences, no property lines, no highways cutting through the dark, just grass, endless, chest-high grass, rolling in every direction like the surface of a slow green ocean. And above it, stars so thick and so bright, they feel close enough to touch. That was the Great Plains 200 years ago. That was the world Sitting Bull was born into. A world of open sky, thundering earth, and the kind of freedom most of us will never understand. Because we've never ever seen what it looks like. Now imagine watching that world disappear. Slowly at first, then all at once. What does a man do when the world around him changes beyond recognition? That is the question at the center of this story. And there is no easy answer. His name at birth was Jumping Badger. He was born around 1831, somewhere near the Grand River in what is now South Dakota. His people were the Hunkpapa Lakota, one of the 7 bands of the Sioux Nation, and they lived and breathed the rhythms of the plains. Picture the camp at dawn, smoke rising from the lodge fires, women working the hides, children chasing each other between the teepees, and in every direction, buffalo. Tens of millions of them. So many that when the herd moved, it sounded like the earth itself was breathing. The buffalo was everything: food, clothing, tools, ceremony. The Lakota did not simply hunt the buffalo. They lived with the buffalo, inside a relationship of dependence and respect that had sustained them for generations. Young Jumping Badger grew up inside all of this. They say he was a quiet boy, deliberate, watchful. But when he counted his first coup in a battle at 14, riding hard against an enemy, striking him with his coup stick rather than killing him, which required even greater courage. His father was so proud he gave the boy his own name. From that day forward, he was Tatanka Iyatake, Sitting Bull. He grew into a man of enormous presence, not just a warrior, though he was ferocious in battle, but a holy man, a visionary, a Wishasha Wakan, a sacred man, who believed that his dreams and visions carried messages from the spirit world. He was generous to a fault. He gave away horses, food, his own possessions, to those in his camp who had less. Among the Lakota, generosity was not charity. It was the measure of a man's character. And he was stubborn, profoundly, magnificently stubborn. That stubbornness would define everything that followed. By the 1860s, the world was shifting beneath his feet. Wagon trains had been rolling west for years. Then came the railroad. Iron and steam cutting across the plains, scattering the buffalo herds, bringing settlers, soldiers, and an appetite for land that seemed to have no bounds. The United States government had signed treaties, piece of paper after piece of paper, promising the Lakota sovereignty over their ancestral lands, and piece of paper after piece of paper, those promises were broken the moment gold was found, or the settlers needed more room, or Washington decided the land was simply too valuable to leave to these savages who had lived on it for centuries. Sitting Bull watched all of this with clear eyes. He did not trust treaties. He did not trust the agents who administered them. He did not trust the United States government. And he was deeply, instinctively suspicious of what the Americans seemed to offer in exchange for Lakota land and the Lakota ways, which was a life on a reservation, farming plots of earth, attending government schools, becoming, in the bluntest of terms, someone else entirely. What does a man do when the world around him changes beyond recognition? Sitting Bull's answer, for as long as he could, was simple. Refuse. Do not comply. The Black Hills, the Pahasapa, were sacred. Not valuable in the way gold is valuable. Sacred in the way a cathedral is sacred for some. The center of Lakota cosmology. The place where the world was understood to have begun. In 1874, General George Armstrong Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills and confirmed what prospectors had been whispering: gold. Within months, thousands of miners were pouring into that land that the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had explicitly guaranteed to the Lakota. The U.S. government offered to buy the Black Hills. Sitting Bull's response was categorical. He reportedly said that he did not want to sell even as much as land as this. And he picked up a pinch of dust from the earth and held it out. Not 1 acre. Not even a handful of dirt. Tensions boiled into war. In the summer of 1876, Sitting Bull had a vision. He danced the sun dance for 36 hours without stopping, slicing his skin, offering his suffering to the Wakantanka, the Great Spirit. And in that trance, he saw soldiers falling from the sky like grasshoppers. He saw them falling into the Lakota camp head first. He told his people, these soldiers are coming and they will be defeated. On June 25th, 1876, Custer and the 7th Cavalry rolled into the valley of the Little Bighorn. What happened next is the most famous battle in the history of the American West. In less than an hour, Custer and more than 200 of his men were dead. The Lakota and their Cheyenne allies, inspired by Sitting Bull's vision, had handed the U.S. Army one of its most stunning defeats. For a single blazing afternoon, the answer to the question, what does a man do when the world changes, was easy. He fights back, and he wins. But the United States did not absorb the lesson of Little Bighorn as a reason to stop. It absorbed it as a reason to accelerate. The army flooded the plains. The buffalo were being slaughtered by commercial hunters, not for food, but for hides, for sport, for the deliberate, strategic purpose of destroying the foundation of Lakota life. Within a decade, an animal that had darkened the horizon in numbers beyond counting was nearly gone. 50 million animals reduced to a few hundred. Without the buffalo, everything fell apart. Sitting Bull led his people north into Canada, where they lived for 4 years in exile. Cold, hungry, slowly starving. The Canadian government would not help them. The Americans would not let them return without surrendering. He held out as long as he could. In 1881, with his people sick and his children hungry, Sitting Bull crossed back into the United States and surrendered at Fort Buford. He was, by most accounts, the last major Lakota leader to do so. He reportedly handed his rifle to his young son to present to the officer so that it would be the boy, not him, who made the gesture of submission. Even in defeat, found a way to refuse. Life on the reservation was its own kind of diminishment. Government rations, broken promises, attempts to stamp out the Lakota language, the Lakota ceremonies, the Lakota way of knowing the world. For a few seasons, he traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, fitting in costume, forming a version of himself for crowds of gaping Americans who thought they were seeing something exotic. Whether he found it demeaning or simply practical, nobody really knows. He was paid. He shook hands with presidents. He gave away most of his wages to the homeless children he saw on the streets of eastern cities, reportedly unable to understand how a nation of such wealth could leave children to starve. That was Sitting Bull. Even at the end, even after everything. In the winter of 1890, a spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance was spreading across the reservations. It promised, through ceremony and prayer, the return of the old world. Buffalo, the free life, the land, desperate people who had lost almost everything. It was a little hope. The US government was terrified of it. And on December 15th, 1890, tribal police arrived at Sitting Bull's cabin to arrest him. In the struggle that followed, he was shot and killed. He was only 59 years old. 14 days later, at a place called Wounded Knee Creek, soldiers of the 7th Cavalry opened fire on a group of Lakota men, women, and children who had been disarmed and were in the process of surrendering. Nearly 300 people were killed, most women and children. They were buried in a mass grave. It was, in the eyes of many, the final act. What do we do with a life like Sitting Bull's? He was not a saint. He was a warrior who fought other tribes as well as the US Army. He was a man of his time and his culture, as all of us are. He made decisions that cost people their lives. He was proud, sometimes inflexible, capable of being politically complicated, even within his own nation. He was also this, a man who looked at everything being offered to him, the treaties, the reservations, slow erosion of everything his people were, and said no with his whole body, for as long as his body could bear it. What does a man do when the world around him changes beyond recognition? He decides what he is willing to lose, and he decides what he is not. Sitting Bull decided there were things he would not trade, and the price of that decision was everything. His freedom, his years, and eventually his life. Whether that makes him a man who failed or a man who succeeded, I'll leave that up to y'all. Some things aren't meant to be answered. Some things are just simply meant to be remembered. One would have to be a fool to think government overreach ended at Wounded Knee. To me, Sitting Bull's story isn't confined to the past. It lives on wherever people refuse to bow their heads. This has been After Midnight Radio with your host, Weezy. Stay curious. Stay skeptical. For the love of everything, stay awake.